So since we're in an energy transition, how in fact do you speed up that energy transition, especially if you're concerned about climate change and the climate crisis? Well, the answer partly is with a transition accelerator, and one has just been created at the University of Calgary, and we're going to be talking to Professor David Layzell, who was involved in setting it up and who is now the research director for the Transition Accelerator. So welcome to the Zoffie, David.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here.
Now, why don't we just start with, can you tell us the story about how and why you set up the Transition Accelerator, please?
Well, I've been working on trying to find climate change solutions for about 22 years or so now, 25 years. And pretty frustrated that we haven't made huge advances. We've seen some incremental changes. And a few years ago, I was thinking a lot about, getting at that career stage where you want to see some results at the end of your career that looking back and thinking, we've really got to take a different approach. And so we looked at the approach that had been done in the past, and we said, well, maybe what we need to do is to really rethink about this as not just being a problem of climate change, but actually being a problem of systems change. And so how do we harness the changes that are already occurring in our systems, and then try to direct them to achieve climate change goals, as well as we got a lot more problems in our existing human systems than just climate change. So the concept of the Transition Accelerator was an organization that would step back and look at transformative systems change, that looks at the things that really drive people to make changes: lower cost, more convenience, more comfort, better service. And what we looked at is then how do we actually embed into those kinds of transformational changes the movement to a low carbon economy.
Well, that's really interesting. Now, I know you've got a couple of projects underway, and the one that I'm really interested in today, we'll touch on the other ones, but the one I really want to concentrate on is the pilot project with the 2 long-haul trucks that run on hydrogen. So could you give us an overview of that project, please?
Yes, well, we started that using the methodology of the Transition Accelerator. We started it by really trying to get a deep understanding of the freight sector, which has a big greenhouse gas emission problems, but it's actually on the cusp of some pretty major transformational changes in the next 5 or 10 years, some big problems in that sector. So we spent a lot of time talking with the companies, the trucking companies, about what the problems were and where the sector was going, and looking at some of the disruptive technologies. We found very interesting is that the companies were very interested in getting, they didn't like diesel very much, and they were keen on finding an alternative. They had what I often call EV envy. They really liked the idea of the electric vehicles with cleanliness, with much fewer moving parts, with the power and the torque potential. But they needed something that was going to actually be able to work for them for long haul, which is most of the trucking are involved in moving very heavy loads, 63 tons gross weight vehicles, long distances, hundreds, thousands of 1,000 kilometers or more. So after many discussions, it was really clear that they were quite excited about the possibility of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So we brought together a consortia of companies and looked at the overall value chain of how you would actually put hydrogen a trucking system, a hydrogen fuel trucking system. And what we were surprised about in some ways is that, in fact, if you actually look at the whole system, we should be able to produce hydrogen without carbon emissions or very low carbon emissions, deliver it and support a heavy duty trucking sector at a lower cost than what actually occurs now with diesel fuel. And we can make hydrogen quite inexpensively and actually about half the cost of wholesale cost of diesel. And the trick is to figure out how to actually get the new system, the new hydrogen fueling system, up to a sufficient scale to get the price down for the overall chain. So the first stage of it was to put the trucks on the road. So we've put together a proposal. We've got some funding from Emission Reductions Alberta. The trucks were donated by Freightliner, Ballard's making the fuel cells, Trimac and Bison Transport are going to be driving the trucks between Edmonton and Calgary and return. Dana Transport is providing the electric axles and assembling the trucks in Montreal. And that project, I hope we're looking at about 14 months from now, the truck should be on the road. Well, and we'll run them on the road for 18 months.
Let's talk first of all about making hydrogen. So I understand that there are a couple of ways to do that. And one is green hydrogen, where you make it through electrolysis using renewable energy like hydro. The other is blue hydrogen, which is made from natural gas, and then the carbon is stripped out of and sequestered in say an old oil and gas reservoir. Mm-hmm. So, and there's been a lot of talk about doing more of that in Alberta. Where are we at with that technology, and are we scaling up, or where are we at?
Actually, it's Alberta is the largest producer of hydrogen in Canada today, and one of the largest producers in the world. We're actually one of the lowest cost producers because we have really low cost natural gas, and we have we've demonstrated our ability to produce it in large quantities at low cost. We use it now. It's what's called gray hydrogen because it's produced in the carbon dioxide most of the time goes into the atmosphere. And we use it as an industrial feedstock to make fertilizer, to convert upgrade bitumen to a synthetic crude oil, to refine oil into gasoline, diesel, and other refined petroleum products, and to make a whole range of chemicals and other materials. So the issue is we already make, I think our estimate is in Alberta is about 3,300 tons of hydrogen per day is across Alberta, most of it gray hydrogen. But there are 3 companies in the province that have, over the last 3 years, they've put on carbon capture technology on their hydrogen production facility. And they're feeding that CO2 into pipelines, either enhanced oil recovery pipelines or in a saline aquifer storage pipelines, to basically keeping the carbon out of the atmosphere. The economics of that is actually becoming very good. It's now just over $50 a ton of CO2, Canadian dollars per ton of CO2 to capture it compared to if you don't capture it. And there's a really strong evidence in talking with the companies that the next round of this technology will be under $50 a ton of CO2 to capture. And if you're putting it into enhanced oil recovery, you can actually get some money back from enhanced oil recovery day because the CO2 stays underground and you get paid for the CO2 that you're putting into a pipeline. So the economics now, especially as we have a carbon tax, which is in the $30 a ton range to going to $50 a ton, it's very soon from now that it'll actually be totally uneconomically viable. So that's, we already are making essentially some blue hydrogen. We see a real opportunity to switch our gray hydrogen production to blue hydrogen, but also expand the use of the hydrogen from basically as an industrial feedstock to a fuel to fuel trucks, but also a fuel to mix in and provide heat, for example, space heating, which is another really difficult area. If you're looking at heating for buildings in cold climates and places like Edmonton or any place in Alberta, to be honest, the amount of natural gas demand in this winter versus the summer is 10 times more in the winter than in the summer. And what we need to do is to figure out how we're going to actually provide the energy. Electricity doesn't seem to be a feasible option for that.
So on the long haul trucking, what are the economics of a hydrogen semi-truck or a hydrogen powered semi-truck versus a diesel powered semi-truck?
Well, the big economics, I'm going to close my door because somebody's grinding coffee, which is a really good idea. All right. So the economics are actually, the economics right now aren't very good. Right now, if you could get hydrogen, we don't have a hydrogen infrastructure, so we have to put in the hydrogen infrastructure, take it to fueling stations. That has to be built, that's new. If as long as you do it, our calculations, as long as you do it at a reasonable scale, in the 2-ton to 10-ton a day per fueling station, that scale, which is going to require literally hundreds of trucks relying on that hydrogen. Our calculation is we should be we should be able to produce the hydrogen, get it to the fueling station, and deliver it retail at a price which is lower than the price of retail price of diesel today. So that's our calculation on the side. The problem is we don't have that infrastructure. So we actually don't have all the vehicles because we don't have the infrastructure, and we don't have the infrastructure because we don't have the vehicles. So we have a bit of a, what we call a futile cycle going on, where it's a cat and mouse problem. So the question, the vehicles now, because we don't really make large scale hydrogen fuel cell trucks, we're making the first 2 in Canada, will be made, and one of the first few in the world, the biggest ones ever made in the world, will be made in Canada in the next 18 months. But they're very expensive vehicles, in the millions of dollars, because they have to be designed and constructed. Most of the calculations that have been looked at this is that if we actually move that to building tens of thousands of vehicles, or the price will come down and be equivalent to or less than a diesel engine. And it's just a matter of getting the manufacturing and scale of production up. So we are looking at a decade or more of building scale, trying to create a new energy system. And what we've been doing in the accelerator is trying to figure out how to do that. Clearly, where we want to go in trucking is to hydrogen fuel cell electric trucks. But we need to get enough demand at the fueling stations to justify bringing in the infrastructure for the fueling stations. So we see a very interesting opportunity to bring another technology into play as part of the transition pathway to a low carbon future for the transport. And that is the modification of diesel engines, of diesel trucks, to put hydrogen injection into the diesel trucks. There's papers going back to the 1970s that have shown that, we know that diesel doesn't burn very clean. We have a lot of particulate matter problems in diesel engines and in the compression. And since the 1970s, there's been literally hundreds of papers published, academic papers, showing that if you inject hydrogen into a diesel cylinder at combustion, you greatly improve the quality of the combustion, and you dramatically reduce your particulate emissions. And so we've been working with some companies that have actually taken this technology and are commercializing it now. They've done it in Europe and in the UK, and now in Vancouver, a Vancouver company. And what this is a device that basically injects hydrogen into the diesel engine, provides about 40% of the energy demand, the fuel demand, and that would create, and there's some benefits of greenhouse gas benefits and air pollution benefits. And so we see that as a way of very rapidly building out the hydrogen demand at fueling stations, so that we'll create the kind of a path, or the kind of a infrastructure that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles can get a foothold.
What kind of dollars are we talking about to build out that infrastructure, David? And is this a role for the federal government to step in and to subsidize this to help scale it up?
We see, this is a very good question, and it's one that we're spending quite a bit of time to look at doing. Part of the question is how. We think that we see the sweet opportunity, the sweet spot, if you like, is around places where we already produce hydrogen today at large quantities. And that would be in the Alberta Industrial Heartland, for example, where we're producing 1,500 tons a day. Fort McMurray and Fort Mackay area, where we're producing probably another 1,500 or so tons a day. Around chlor-alkali plants that are distributed across Canada that make sodium hydroxide, they actually produce hydrogen as a waste product. Places in Canada that have really excess green electricity, hydropower, nuclear, where they can do green hydrogen production, and they can produce it at a low enough cost that creates a pocket where you can build demand. We see building around each of these centers sort of essentially an infrastructure, and would probably be pipelines, but fueling stations, And with fleet vehicles, heavy fleet vehicles, bus vehicles, for example, municipal bus fleets that can go to hydrogen buses, and to get the scale up with both hydrogen diesel biofuel vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles using the same fueling stations, and getting the scale up to a scale which actually becomes economic and pays for itself within a few years. So it's going to need some public money in to start that process. We then see, once we have these pockets, we start growing them out along our transportation corridors, like a spider web, and growing out across Canada, again, possibly with some infrastructure funding, but spending a lot of time to making sure that we target the public investment in a way that gives us a rapid movement to where it does not require continuous public investment. And we see a pathway of doing that, which is very promising, but it is a 20-year or 30-year plan.
So how many public dollars are we talking here? Would $1 billion do it? Would $5 billion do it? Are we talking hundreds of millions maybe?
It's, I think we're looking here as very similar to the way we've actually done investments and built the energy system we have today. The energy system today wasn't built on carbon taxes or anything else. It was built, the energy system we have in Canada today was built through usually government decisions on major, essentially our whole Canadian system is built on big decisions, say around, well, it's setting up a Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway, which actually totally changed the movement of goods across in the Ontario and Quebec, etc. Putting in the railway, the CP railway across Canada, opened up Western Canada. Putting in the Trans-Canada, the pipeline, the natural gas pipeline, 60 years ago it was being built. It was really good for Western Canada because it allowed a place to get a stranded natural gas resource into a market. It's fantastic for Ontario and Eastern Canada because it gave a much lower cost form of energy that could actually get us off oil. And when the oil crisis hit in '73, that, you know, people were switching from off oil for home heating to natural gas. Those are kind of nation building investments that we see that we need to be thinking about as we move, I would argue, into a hydrogen economy, which is, it's basically hydrogen and electricity. We have to grow our green electricity, and we have to grow low carbon hydrogen across Canada. Investments is probably in the billions of dollars, absolutely. Whether it's the return on investment, which is even more important. There is an investment up front, but in our analysis is that we can quickly get to a point where we actually start creating the jobs and creating the economic opportunities that come with moving to a low carbon economy. So I think the overall cost is a good question. We don't know, but it's in the billions.
David, this will be our last question. So if everyone who wants to ask a question can put up their blue hand, and we'll get to your question after we're finished this last one. So David, what exactly kind of infrastructure are we talking about? Are we talking pipelines to get hydrogen from where it's manufactured to the fueling station? Are we talking about, you know, a lot of money that has to go into the actual refueling station at the, you know, the service station where the trucks now fuel up? Are we talking about building whole new plants to build hydrogen? What does that look like?
We are doing quite a bit of work to try to define that as precisely as possible. Our analysis is that if we can demonstrate the demand, we're trying to build a new value chain, a new energy system. And like any chain, it's only as good as its weakest link. So the issue is to put in the public money in the right spot at the right time to create a value chain, a new value chain. And so that the value chain is robust, and when the public money stops, it holds together. Our analysis is that there's enough money in this system, and indeed there's many companies in the world that have come to the same analysis. We've met with a lot of the big energy companies. We show them our numbers and they say, yeah, we know it's, you know, this is actually going to be cost competitive with our fossil fuel sector. The way we're doing it today, this is gone, but we got to put the value chain together. So our our thought is to, again, very target, very locally, and in each area, it has to be hand custom designed as to what is the weakest link, and we support those links to get a value chain that actually holds together. So I would say it's not as simple as one policy, put a big pipeline in, that's not going to do it, right? It's going to be a matter of creating demand, developing it in areas, build on the interest of the coalition of the willing, the companies that want to get engaged, but also the resources that are available in that sector. So I would say it's not a simple black and white, we got to do X. It's a matter of thinking very critically about and really understanding how our existing energy system works, and understanding that this new energy system is going to have will have to be hand built and figure out how to do that.
Okay, Dave Patterson, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Wow, that was very interesting and uplifting information. I'm wondering if there's any other instances of, the shift to hydrogen around the world. I can think of a couple, like the Japanese are starting to test green hydrogen production, and they're going to build about, I think, 18 gigawatts of renewables in Australia to export electricity and hydrogen to Asia. But any other hotspots around the world?
Absolutely. Actually, if you go on Google and type in the German energy strategy, which came out yesterday or day before yesterday, hundreds of millions of dollars, of pounds, of euros, I guess it is, hundreds of millions, or actually billions of euros that they're putting in, that in order to develop a hydrogen strategy. A very progressive approach that they're deploying. We're just still trying to understand it a bit more, because it's just as came out the other day. Australia has a very strong hydrogen strategy, and every state of Australia has their own hydrogen strategy. The South Koreans and the Japanese, they've already gone out in the last years. 6 months ago, these Japanese came out and said they want to import 300,000 tons of liquid hydrogen per year into Japan, in order to basically drive their energy systems there. And they're looking for the lowest cost place to do it. And one of the things, there's a very interesting report that that was published by the Japanese about 2 years ago. They went around the world and said, where's the lowest cost place in the world that can produce low carbon hydrogen? And they identified Russia and Canada as the two lowest. And it's basically for blue hydrogen production. And we're not, I'm afraid, the Australians are already making hydrogen and sending it to Australia as liquid hydrogen. So they see that as a export market. I think what we're seeing, there are about 20 countries of the world that have a hydrogen strategy now. And Canada is a bit behind, but it will come out this summer. And we're collaborating, working closely with the group that is actually putting the Canadian strategy together. So I think we'll see a Canadian strategy for hydrogen by August or September of this year.
Well, David, I'm really curious if we're a little behind now, if we can accelerate the work we're doing on the hydrogen economy. What are some of the advantages of being a first mover or an early mover in this space that might create technology or might create other exports to other countries that would be, an advantage of investing early in this technology?
Well, I think that if the first place in the world to create a hydrogen corridor of a significant size that has low-cost hydrogen, that is cost-effective at providing hydrogen. We're arguing the target price we need in Canada is about $3.50 a kilogram. I'm talking Canadian dollars. It's $25 a gigajoule. So when you think about it, when you buy when you buy diesel fuel at the pumps and you're paying what, $1.05 a liter, that's around, what is that? That's about $28 or something like that a gigajoule. And so what we're doing is trying to bring in hydrogen at a lower price, and a gigajoule of hydrogen will take a vehicle further than a gigajoule of diesel, right? Because of a better drivetrain in a fuel cell vehicle. So if we have such a corridor where we're having fueling stations and we're providing it at that price, we think that that the heavy vehicle, the manufacturing should be very attractive to be, if these vehicles work well, that companies will start to want to try all their vehicles here, because there's no other place in the world that has fuel stations, a supply of hydrogen. So we're designing a system that would create corridors for heavy vehicles, both on heavy trucks, but also trains and airport vehicles, the ground vehicles at airports that are on basically they're in the industrial regions. So we're not talking about putting a hydrogen filling station on every street corner. And so we don't even see really a big market for them in personal vehicles. We see the market is in heavy freight, and which means a very few number of large fueling stations can actually work, right? Whereas totally different market in personal mobility. So we think that the early adopters, the first place that actually creates that kind of a market, like an opportunity, a fuel market, will actually attract a lot of companies that see hydrogen manufacturing, design, testing new types of equipment, and it'll be a real technology pull as well as a pull for jobs.
So essentially, if I understand this correctly, is you want to create a hydrogen cluster in Canada that attracts, basically you get all of the, industrial companies tend to cluster in one area because there are economies of scale, and there are other advantages being able to access professional services and so on when you're in close proximity to each other. Well, I think that's a great idea. Now, what about some of the objections? If I was going to play devil's advocate here, and I wish I knew more about the hydrogen economy so I could actually do it, but if I was going to do it, what kind of objections would I raise to using hydrogen, about basically developing a hydrogen economy for transportation?
I think the biggest problem is we don't have the infrastructure at this point, and I think the fuel cell technology has been proven. It has to be adapted for each vehicle type, and obviously that takes time, and you got to get manufacturing up. But I think there's, fuel cell vehicles have been around for 30 years, and they're getting better all the time. And actually, I would argue the evidence for fuel cell buses, municipal buses, it's a proven technology and there's literally thousands of them around the world. We need to get to the millions of them, but I think it's a proven enough technology that there's relatively low risk. I think that there's there's concern sometimes about the safety issue, but in fact actually is, I think many of the analysis that we've been looking at is, there's actually much more dangerous with liquid fuels if it catches fire, right? I mean, what happens if there's a leak from a hydrogen tank is it basically, and it catches fire, it's just a shot of a flame coming up, and whereas it's not going to encompass the whole vehicle and burn. I think many of us have seen other issues. So we have problems with all of our fuels. There's a lot of energy in them, and obviously they have to be cautions. And I think we know how to do it with hydrogen, as we do. We essentially, many people say, from who we've talked to, that hydrogen is actually probably safer than our existing fuels.
What about the issue of using hydrogen for space heating? Because I've talked to Maggie Hanna, who's a colleague of yours, and she argues that in fact natural gas can be combined with hydrogen, and then that reduces the GHG emissions. and you can use existing infrastructure and so on. What's the size of the opportunity there?
It's very large. I would say that it's we need a learning to go through on this now, where the next 5 to 10 years, we know we can put hydrogen into our natural gas pipelines at about 5% volume mix, 10%, even with some places in the world are going up to 20% of the volumetric mix of hydrogen. That, because hydrogen's a lower energy density per unit volume, a 20% mix is about 7.25% of the energy, right? So it's about a threefold difference. And what that means is that when you get above 20%, you've got to, you can get up to about 20% in our existing infrastructure without a lot of infrastructure changes. And we're in discussions with lots of companies who are actually actively wanting to do that in order to meet the new clean fuel standards that's coming down, the new clean fuel standards coming down for all gaseous fuels in the next couple of years, but also to give us a learning curve and put in the infrastructure to supply, to reduce the carbon intensity of, say, space heating and water heating in homes. The real issue, though, is at a point is we need to actually go, I would say, once you get to 20%, we got the infrastructure in place, we start switching communities, one community at a time, across to pure hydrogen. And that's going to require more infrastructure changes. It's very interesting. There's a project in the UK in Leeds called H21 project that is actually doing this. They're going into the city of Leeds and they're basically taking subdivision by subdivision. And during the summer, when they not very much gas use, they just go in and they can convert the entire subdivision into hydrogen. And then by the next winter, you switch over the summer from a natural gas system to a hydrogen system. The economics of it in Canada, in the UK, the economics are a little better because they pay a lot for gas. We don't pay very much for our natural gas. So the economics aren't there yet. They're there in terms of the clean fuel standard. They make sense to meet the clean fuel standard. But the longer term economics for larger scale changes will require really having the infrastructure in place. So what we've been designing in the Transition Accelerator is a network grid where it turns out that the locations where you would inject hydrogen into a natural gas pipeline happen to be in the same industrial locations where you need heavy trucking fueling stations. And so the same infrastructure pipeline can serve both heavy industry and heavy trucking and as well as our natural gas pipeline, as well as the added addition of hydrogen. There's also work that I think is really important that a number of the pipeline companies are doing about just converting natural gas pipelines into hydrogen pipelines and basically repurposing existing pipeline infrastructure. As we well know, there are a number of pipelines in Canada. We used to move a lot of natural gas, for example, from Western Canada to Eastern Canada. And then Pennsylvania took off and took the market away in Ontario. So there's a lot of empty pipelines. And some of those have the actual composition, the steel composition, that you could actually convert to hydrogen. Other ones you might have to put a liner inside them, or we may have to rethink. And there's quite a bit of work going on now to try to look at the feasibility of repurposing in the next 20 years some of our existing infrastructure for hydrogen. And you have to change the compressors and and that sort of thing. But that it's not going to be near as expensive as actually building a new pipeline from scratch.
Now, Dave Patterson, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
So I had a comment about the hydrogen distribution, or a comment anyway. Certainly on like a local provincial level, we've already got hydrogen distribution. If you've got a large hydrogen storage bullet at your power plant, the big tractor trailer hydrogen truck comes along every once in a while and fills it up.
That's difficult to do with gases, and especially with hydrogen as a gas. The economics, we spent a lot of time looking at the economics for it. You can move.
No, well, they transport as liquid, and they store it in your local bullet as liquid, exactly. And then you've got to obviously gasify it for the vehicle.
And certainly that can be done. And there, I see it as a sort of an interim process that, you know, as you're trying to build out a hydrogen economy, you can make liquid hydrogen. You basically cryogenically cool it. Like, it's very similar to liquid natural gas. You drop the temperature, liquid natural gas, you drop the temperature to -160, and you got liquid natural gas, that's degrees Celsius. In liquid hydrogen, you have to drop it to -252 degrees Celsius, and then you get liquid hydrogen. And that's what Japan wants to import and South Korea wants to import. They want, you know, and so we've been working on a project to look at the LNG terminals that are being talked about being built in British Columbia. The same technology basically to make LNG, you can make liquid hydrogen. And in fact, you can get, you know, a lot better price for liquid hydrogen than you can get for liquid natural gas. And our calculations are, you know, if we actually put the infrastructure in place, you would actually make more money making liquid hydrogen and selling a zero emission hydrogen fuel off the West Coast than you would selling liquid natural gas. And we see the markets as being there. The first liquid, if you want to go on Google, Mitsubishi has just built the first liquid hydrogen ship, right? To carry, you know, the hydrogen around. And so we see that as possibly a growth. It's going to be essentially an extension, I would say, of the LNG market. It would be an LH2 market.
Now, this will be the last question, and then we'll let Dave get back to his actual work. So Dave Juice, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Just a quick comment. When a ship running liquid, you know, hydrogen, basically you can't have a perfect seal. So the vapors coming off are enough to move the ship, so it costs you nothing.
Exactly.
Basically. So that's a huge advantage to using LNG or liquid hydrogen. Great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, great. Thank you very much, folks. David, really appreciate you sharing your insights and your knowledge today. And we'll stay in touch because I'm really interested in what the Transition Accelerator, the role it will play in facilitating some of the transition to different fuels and decarbonization of our economy. So thank you very much and good luck with your work.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.